Today's Old Testament reading comes from Isaiah chapter 49, verses 1 through 7. Listen to me, all you in distant lands. Pay attention, you who are far away. The Lord called me before my birth. From within the womb he called me by name. He made my words of judgment as sharp as a sword. He has hidden me in the shadows of his hand. I am like a sharp arrow in his quiver. He said to me, "You are my servant, Israel, and you will bring me glory." I replied, "But my works seem so useless. I've spent my strength doing nothing and to no use. Yet I leave it all in the Lord's hands. I will trust God for my reward." And now the Lord speaks, the one who formed me in my mother's womb to be his servant, who commissioned me to bring Israel back to him. The Lord has honored me, and my God has given me strength. He says, "You will do more than restore the people of Israel to me. I will make you a light to the Gentiles, and you will bring my salvation to the ends of the earth." The Lord, the Redeemer and Holy One of Israel, says to the one who is despised and rejected by the nations, to the one who is the servant of rulers, "Kings will stand at attention when you pass. Princes will also bow low because of the Lord, the faithful one, the Holy One of Israel, who has chosen you." The epistle reading comes from Acts chapter 14, verse 21 through 28. After preaching the good news in Derbe and making many disciples, Paul and Barnabas returned to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch in Pisidia, where they strengthened the believers. They encouraged them to continue in the faith, reminding them that we must suffer many hardships to enter the kingdom of God. Paul and Barnabas also appointed elders in every church. With prayer and fasting, they turned the elders over to the care of the Lord, in whom they had put their trust. Then they traveled back through Pisidia to Pamphylia. They preached the word in Perga and went to
Probably Italia.
Okay, Italia. Finally, they returned by ship to Antioch of Syria, where their journey had begun. The believers there had entrusted them to the grace of God to do the work they had now completed. Upon arriving in Antioch, they called the church together and reported everything God had done through them and how he had opened the door to faith to the Gentiles too. And they stayed there with the believers for a long time. This is the word of God for the people of God.
So the duck went back to the coffee shop. Yeah, if you talk to the people, who said the first Sunday when I came here, looked up and said, "Oh, it can't get worse than this," tell them they're wrong. The jokes have sequels now. Duck went back to the coffee shop. This time he asked the man behind the counter, "Do you have any chapstick?" The man behind the counter's face turned red with anger. "No, this is a coffee shop. We do not carry chapstick." Suddenly, the man's face turned to a sly smile. "But you have a good day, Mr. Duck, and I hope to see you again." The duck smiled, turned 180 degrees, and left the coffee shop. The next day, the duck returned. On the counter of the coffee shop was prominently displayed a layout containing 6 different flavors of chapstick. The man behind the counter was there again, only this time he was smiling. The duck asked the man behind the counter, "Do you have any chapstick?" The man beamed and gestured his hand toward the container. He picked up an individual chapstick and held it up. "I have chapstick, Mr. Duck. What would you like me to do?" The duck looked up and said, "Put it on my bill." Now, again, presumably, we do not know why the duck wanted chapstick. That'd be good flavor for a coffee shop there. But we don't know, why did the duck so badly want chapstick? Why would he go to a coffee shop? And it sounds, trivial, but imagine this. Imagine you were in the middle of the desert and your lips had been chapped for hours and you had no chapstick. How would that feel? How would you feel even worse if you were in the middle of the desert for hours and were thirsty? It's our job to share the living water in a world in which many are thirsty, and many of them don't even realize how thirsty they are. Now, imagine a little different scenario. Imagine you're stuck in the desert, but you have shade and you have a well. And from this well, every time you shared the water in the well, the water would get better tasting and better for you. And every time you shared from the well, the water would double in volume. Now, if it were the case, and a person came along in the desert pretty thirsty, would you share the water with them? That sounds like an easy question, but I have to wonder if some people would find excuses not to share in spite of all those obvious rewards. All persons are called to believe, to have faith that Jesus was and is God in the flesh. As Christians, we're called to respond to God's love, to respond to our baptisms by believing and spreading the gospel message. There are many different ways to minister, and again, the three congregations here in the charge have very impressive missions and ministry to the communities and out to the world. Our challenge is to find where our individual talents can be used in ministry, usually in more ways than one. One of the spiritual gifts in the Bible is evangelism, but you don't have to have that certain gift to share the gospel message. In our actions and words, let's show how we believe in Jesus and share Jesus. One of the ways we can use whichever gifts we have in ministry is to spread the news of who Jesus is, what he taught, what he teaches today. When we think of evangelism, maybe we think of evangelistic services or a brightly colored van with a bullhorn traveling slowly through neighborhoods, news about Jesus coming out of the bullhorn. I've been to several evangelistic services, found them worthwhile. People came forward. And the problem is, as you may have heard me say, in 2019, the odds of getting the people there inside at the service who need to be there, the odds are long. A brightly colored van with a bullhorn sharing any message would probably lead someone today to call the police. So we think about spreading Christ's love, and we think of new ways of doing it. And it's more difficult than it was 100 or 200 years ago. Back then, Christianity was part of the culture, a base of knowledge that people had even if they didn't believe. Today, it's far different than that. When I was in seminary in the 80s, the story was told of a young woman who was going to college in York who asked, "I hear people talking about Jesus. Who is this Jesus person?" I don't know if that story was true firsthand, but I find it all too easy to believe. In the 90s, I received a phone call from an unchurched woman whose daughter was considering getting married in a church I served. The woman was calling, I'm thinking, various churches in the community. And she asked me, "Tell me, how many of those bench things are there in the church?" Bench things. I had to think for a minute. Then I answered, "Pews." And she said, "Well, those bench things." And when I said the word pews, she didn't say, "Oh, yes." No, the word pews was completely unfamiliar to her. She lived in a village town about the size of Mont Alto, and there were a couple churches there. But our daughter was getting married. She had never heard the word pews or knew what a pew was. Some years ago, the fellow who was my DS shared the story of when he went into a gas station with a T-shirt that mentioned Jesus. It was the T-shirt probably from one of our, United Methodist events and gatherings, and he had his T-shirt on, mentioned Jesus. And the young fellow, he went inside to pay for his gas. The young fellow behind the counter responded excitedly. He said, "Jesus, I just heard that name and found out who he was last week in my philosophy course in college." So that was kind of exciting and started a brief conversation. So the culture has changed, and we can't assume the people in our backyards know who Jesus is or what a pew is or what happens in churches. But while the culture has changed, our call to spread Christ's message in peace and love does not change. And the words of the Old Testament reading, centuries before Jesus was born in Bethlehem, apply no less to us today than they did to their original hearers. You heard, "You are my servant, in whom I will display my splendor." God the Father talking to his people Israel. But it's the same message to us today. "You are my servant, in whom I will display my splendor." We can show how wonderful God is even through our faults and shortcomings. "I will also make you a light for the Gentiles, that my salvation may reach the ends of the earth." Again, God to the Israelites, but God also to us today, and we need to remember the ends of the earth starts in our backyard. So God said in his holy word that he would make us the light that would transform the world. We doubt ourselves sometimes, and that's only human, but let's not doubt God. Let's believe and respond. Let's believe God's promise to guide us and spread the good news of Christ's life, death, and the rebirth in people that Jesus can bring. Our call to spread the message doesn't change, but how to do it most effectively, we know that changes, especially in this challenging time. We have a lot more opportunity to share who Jesus is in our communities. In a strange sort of way, it's a positive. It's a positive, number one, because when we read the book of Acts, we can learn a lot more from what happened in the book of Acts. People say, "Well, how can I talk about Jesus in this culture that doesn't understand?" Well, how did they do it in the book of Acts? Spreading out the word in a culture where almost no one had heard of Jesus at that time. So the first Christians also lived in a difficult time. Christianity was almost unknown back then, yet we read how they moved forward with courage and move the church forward by sharing the good news about Jesus. Today, billboards, signboards, internet sites, social media, friendships through work and community and neighbors spread involvement in effective ways, reaching out with the gospel message. And another good part of it today, again, our task, there are so many persons who do not believe or understand Christianity, that our nation, our communities, we can say the field is ripe for harvest. And preparing this field for harvest is for all who believe, not just for some specialists. Studies show most new people who come to worship do so because a friend asked them. If in knowing Jesus we have the greatest treasure of all time and space, a treasure that only grows as we share it, how can we not burn with desire to let others in on it? And again, if you don't have special training in evangelism and outreach, that's okay. Because these days, the training would probably be obsolete in a few years anyway. We'd probably come back in a few years, they'd say, "Oh, ignore what we told you 3 years ago, now it's this and this." So don't worry if you don't have special training. Talk to people you know at the right times about God. The commitment to mission shows here. And, that can relate to the burning desire to reach out and help others. Life in this world can be as cool as a desert, but we know we have the living water that is Jesus Christ, water made to be shared. There are people whose lives are in despair, and we can make their lives better by showing them the face of Jesus. Next month, our Lenten journey to the cross will begin. Our larger Christian journey is a lifetime journey. Now, sometimes if you're riding around in a car, people can tell if you're on a trip, maybe by the way you're dressed, or maybe the luggage is strapped above your car. If they see suitcases, they know you're on some kind of a journey. Can people see our spiritual suitcases and know that we're on the journey with Jesus? The journey to be better people, the journey to make the world a better place. This afternoon, I'll be packing a literal physical suitcase, really a garment bag for this trip to the continuing education seminar. And I'm going to make sure my toothpaste is in there. I'm going to make sure my shaver is in there. Consider now those kinds of spiritual suitcases. The Christians in Acts had compassion and concern in their suitcases, hope and help in their suitcases, persistence and power in their suitcases. What's in your spiritual suitcase? May people see our actions, our decisions, and our priorities as those of people on the Christian journey. So in our actions and words, let's show how we believe in Jesus and share Jesus. Like the prophet Isaiah and like the people in the book of Acts, we live in uncertain times. Yet in the midst of this, we see hope and help and God at work. We see mission and ministry and know there's good within us, within our friends, individually and together. Isaiah prophesied in ways that risked his life. The first believers in the book of Acts shared the good news in ways that risked their lives. We don't have to literally risk our lives to spread the hope and love Jesus can bring, but we have to believe and we have to spread Christ's message and Christ's love. So with that in mind, we turn this morning to our closing song, and please give your attention to those folks on my left, your right, as we sing together, "Oh, My Fountains." And please rise if you're comfortable standing.